And Nezhapi, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jazz. Due to the time limitations, I'm going to mainly sort of whiz through this. Obviously, in education, there's a lot of ground to cover, and I will not be aiming to touch on all the points that you might be expecting to hear. A quick overview, starting off with a few issues in education, then I'll be moving on to issues of significance from my perspective in relation to the object of urban design and the value of other perspectives. And I'll finish by highlighting the need for more than a single story and suggest, from my perspective, some implications for action. Next, please. Okay. So just some quick definitions around diversity and inclusion, words that we hear so often. Diversity meaning how we respond to differences in others. And inclusion is basically about, how we ensure that those others in whom we see differences are enabled to participate. That's the sort of approach that I'll be taking with this. So certainly within higher education, over the last decade or so, there has been this agenda to widen participation. And there have been successes with this agenda in terms of the wider reach and the larger proportion of the population that now attends higher education. Disparities persist, and one of these remains, particularly within the educational outcomes of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students. Next, please. Okay. So this is just an extract from the Mayor of London's Supporting Diversity Handbook. It's focusing on architecture, which is one of the streams that tends to feed into urban design. And it's highlighting that these barriers to entering the profession can be seen at every stage, from application to part 3. It's also highlighting the proportion of white students applying for a place and being accepted compared to the proportion of Black and minority ethnic students being accepted. And again, it's sort of highlighting this point in terms of at each stage from part 1 through to part 3, there's a decline in the proportion of minority ethnic students qualifying for those stages. Next, please. So what's the significance of this? In societal terms, is it just about social justice? Is it just about, trying to kind of make a business case for why urban design should be looking at this? Or is it just about professional issues? Certainly from the standpoint of education and from my perspective, I think knowledge and what the discipline is aiming to build knowledge on is really important. So a key critique of Cuthbert in his paper reviewing 50 years of urban design was in his view, an unclear basis, academic basis for urban design in terms of what urban design's object is. Certainly, increasingly with the rate of urbanization, it's quite clear, urban design is concerned with settlements, in particular the urban, the city, as a key object of urban design focus and research. However, we're still grappling with what a city is. There's a list on this slide referring to Gordon Childs' urban revolution, and the factors that he considered, this was 1950, were important in the urban revolution and in identifying urban settlements. So some keywords there: power, elite control, hierarchy, specialization, monumental architecture, some others around writing, long-distance trade. These have been tremendously influential. Next slide. In terms of how cities are defined. So sociologists, added and confirmed from their perspective in the 20th century that sort of list of criteria for cityness. While there has been more recent challenges or critique of some of these criteria, it's still a work in progress in terms of really defining what a city is. In 1965, Christopher Alexander's classic essay, "A City is Not a Tree," added to this debate by highlighting what a city, in his view, is not. It is not a structure or configuration, in his view, that is organized in a tree-like or hierarchical manner. When you look at the old cities and how they work. And he identified this hierarchical thinking as being a key sort of barrier to achieving complexity in new towns and new places. Next. So on this slide, the main point being made here is that for much of the 20th century, there has been this single story about what a city is. There have been a lot of debates about which settlements qualify for city status and which ones don't. Particularly, I'm going to focus here on Africa. One of the prevailing views was that Africa was cityless in the pre-colonial era, that there was no indigenous urbanism. Taking the earlier criteria into account, even the Yoruba, who lived in towns, again, lots of arguments about these are not urban settlements for these reasons if we compare it against these ideal criteria. So the work of urban archaeologists around the Niger River in Mali since 1977 has thrown some of those ideas into disarray in terms of what they have been uncovering about really early settlements. Since this work was done, even earlier settlements have been found around that area. So what was unique about them was that they did not conform to this hierarchical central organization. They did not appear to have any power elite. They were clusters, componential cities with specialists, that supplied a much wider hinterland. Their organization was what has been termed Hetzer ARCIC, and they were notable for a lack of intersite conflict, a lack of warfare. So these were quite peaceful, very industrious, very dense settlements that managed to keep centralizing tendencies at bay. Again, this goes counter to the urban criteria that we have become accustomed to discussing within urban design and planning. Next, please. So in terms of how do we go beyond a single story, work has obviously been done by advanced higher education and various universities looking at what an inclusive curriculum might look like and what its components might be. But the general agreement is that it's really important to ensure that students can see themselves and their cultures in the curriculum. Certainly during my education, this was something that was often very lacking. All the textbooks, started off with Greece and Rome, Only rarely would they mention ancient Egypt or cities in the East, or in other parts of the world. So again, what's really important about the African example that I mentioned is the way in which it has challenged prevailing theories around cityness, and has encouraged scholars looking at settlements in northern China, in parts of Mesopotamia, and in other parts of the world to reconsider their data, rather than always trying to make it fit the Eurocentric model. Next, please. So I will end with a number of questions here. Are we educating what I would call the new colonizers, in the sense that we're equipping them to simply impose Western design principles globally? And following on from that, I mean, I think it's a positive move that many courses now have or include or allow student projects that are based in other parts of the world. So there's this more kind of global view of relevant projects. However, do those projects enable students to gain a real cultural appreciation and respect for the cities that they are working in? To what extent do the curricula include a wide enough scope of approaches geographically and culturally, and looking at much deeper historical timescales? This was a critique that Amos Rappaport made back in 1990 about the need for environmental design to be much wider in scope and much deeper in terms of temporal considerations. And in terms of process, how can we increase mentorship and role models across the professional educational journey? These have been shown to be quite important in terms of encouraging students from disadvantaged backgrounds to enter the profession, and in terms of their retention once they are within the educational system. Next, please. So some suggestions are about including studies or cases that explore diverse cultural urban design principles and urbanism practices. So it's not just about doing a project in a developing city that has lots of problems with informality. That's really important in terms of grappling with current needs and dilemmas. However, to what extent does that still promote a view of cities in such places as always being problematic, and not having an urban heritage of their own that could be drawn upon? So helping students to adopt a more inclusive lens in terms of the diversity within the historical context of cultural spatialities and the innovations that different cultures have made to urban design and planning. And how can this then facilitate a greater contextualization of the ongoing challenges that we see with current globalization? So in terms of knowledge, which I think is really, really critical to developing that respect for the places in which we work, and not simply seeing them as places that are just, full of problems and lacking any sort of agency or historical urban approaches of their own, is that we renew interactions between urban archaeologists and scholars of ancient and modern urbanism, so that we are really looking at and learning from the full sort of temporal scope of urban examples that there are. Thank you. I think that's my final slide.
Thanks for listening. Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
I will skip through things. Thank you very much for that, Nezhapi. That was really, really a very interesting 10 minutes on the interface between theory, pedagogy, education, and then exclusion. it sparked some really interesting questions in the chat box that I'm just reviewing now. I particularly find the point you raise about Western design principles being exported globally really fascinating, and I think there could be some very interesting discussion about that. You know, we could have a session on that on its own, really. I'm thinking of particularly in reference to some of the points Robert's made, and also Simon Felton, about the ongoing work with the BBC, whatever they're called, commission, and some of the stuff that the communities and local government are pushing. There seems to be some sort of, I think there's some interesting discussion we can have about that. Because we are very short on time, I'm going to quickly, what we'll do is we'll pause the discussion around education for a minute. I will speak very quickly, 3 or 4 minutes, about my own views, my own experiences, and then perhaps we can open it up to sort of 5-10 minutes of discussion before we move to Aisha and Noha on the final point. And then I'm keen to make sure that we have at least sort of 10-15 minutes for action points that emerge from the discussion, because I think that will be the most interesting part. So before I get into some of the things you're seeing on the slides, I mentioned in the beginning that me personally, I was going to address this as part of my own personal views and personal experiences, and I think a lot of what Nezhapi touched upon, it really is reflected in my own experiences of the transition from education to professional practice. I mean, my first experience of architecture was as a 17-year-old. I went to an open day, I remember, at Cambridge for their architecture, their Part 1 program. And from a state school background, I attended the open day, and I remember immediately sort of looking around the class and seeing nobody who sort of looked or sounded or spoke in the same way I did. I remember the professor making jokes about how you couldn't really make any money from architecture, and you'd be working sort of 60 hours a week for little to no pay. And, you know, as a 17-year-old, making money was actually quite important to me. It still is quite important to me. And I remember feeling as if I was sort of always 2 steps behind others in the group, just because they may have had already some experience about the practice of architecture, what architects do, and what they don't do. And, you know, it was, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but what I was feeling was coming from a place of disadvantage, because others had already sort of had some form of leg up through some internship or through professional connections or things like that. And it's only now, as I reflect on that sort of, you know, over however long it's been, 15 years or so into the future, you look back and you see that your students entering the professional field don't really come on an even footing. And obviously, I'm very aware that we're talking mostly about architecture, and I think one of the issues is, as urban design operates between the interface of several related disciplines, architecture, planning, landscape architecture, to name a few, we don't have as much data or diversity studies about matters of inclusion related to urban design practices. So the things I'll mention in the following couple of slides are very much sort of my own anecdotal experience. But I mean, one of the things we spoke about in some of the chats that informed this discussion is that for a lot of people, urban design feels as if it's a career you kind of fall into. It's mostly your second professional degree after having studied planning architecture, landscape architecture, or geography, you know, other things. And is there a relationship between the fact that urban design isn't really on the radar for many sort of 16, 17-year-olds, especially if they don't have a family member or access to someone who is within the built environment profession? It's normally, I mean, just reverting back to my experiences at studying architecture, the typical type of student enrolling on a Part 1 course has a father or an uncle or an aunt who's a surveyor, or, you know, something involved with property, and then they become interested in the role of an architect because it's, you know, it's seen as interesting. Urban design, I guess, doesn't have that same, I would say, sense of elitism from the offset. But is there an issue in that we're not reaching the a wide enough bracket of people because because we're not so familiar to a lot of students doing A levels, and they don't understand what the role of an urban designer is and how they can affect change. I mean, I would also say that where I have come into contact and had the pleasure of collaborating with practitioners from minority groups, they do tend to be very impassioned, very insightful, and really bring a different perspective to projects, which I think is what we'll hopefully hear from Noha and Aisha later. It is normally a different experience of possibly inner city living, or how different cultures inhabit space, how bringing a diversity of views on interaction in public space, which I think is absolutely crucial to our the success of our work. And one of the things I have noticed is often in work carried out in London, not only London, but many major cities throughout, that there are, because of the way cities are built and sort of racial segregation has a spatial dimension, can local authorities and local governments do more about encouraging and facilitating local representation during the undertaking of certain master planning exercises, planning policy exercises, regenerative schemes? I would never highlight them in a public forum, but I've seen several projects where certain consultants are employed, and in an area that is really defined by its ethnic makeup. And one does wonder where the sort of social fabric of a certain place is so embedded and intertwined with its racial or ethnic makeup. How much can an outsider really engage? I mean, surely there's some need to have a bit more local knowledge and a bit of local insight in those particular projects. I won't talk too heavily on the graphs that you can see, but this is an interesting quote, some things I picked out from the AJ's racial diversity survey, but it all relates to architecture. Some of the lessons I think we can apply to work in urban design. And then the other point I'm keen to highlight is entry into the profession doesn't necessarily equate to progression. And whilst certain aspects of the work of an urban designer are more diverse than others, I think specifically working with public sector consultants, or rather public sector officers and staff, you tend to work with a more diverse group when compared to the private sector. The property industry as a whole is very much still largely white, largely middle class, and I'd also add to that largely male as well. So I think there are different multiple levels of exclusion, especially in urban design. We are frequently working outside of city centres in rural areas where the places and areas tend to be more sort of ethnically homogenous. And what role, I guess, I think this is more of a question, but what role does the property industry more holistically have in needing to sort of encourage a wider participation of different voices? Is there, we all know there are problems with NIMBYism and a general feeling of anxiety when it comes to different types of urban development outside of city centres. How much is that associated with an attitude towards xenophobia or fear of other people moving in, and how does that interface with race-based discrimination? I mean, the images you can see on the screen, that took about a 30-second Google image search of a property networking event, and I would sort of encourage you to play spot the non-white person. You'll probably be playing for a little while. So those are just my tokenal sort of insight from both the academic side and then my time in practice. And I think with that, it might be good to sort of pause and open it up for sort of 5 or 10 minutes of comments before we move to the final section. Noha, can I ask you if you've selected any interesting comments that you'd like to ask members of the audience to speak more about?
Yeah, I think there was a point about, there was one about salaries that Brian brought up. Do we need to talk about money, salaries, and the extent to which people end up with patchy income? long periods of study, interning, etc. Anything about income discrimination, you might say.
Sorry, Noah, was that for me to ask the question, or are you asking it on my behalf?
Oh, that's a good point. Dad, what did we agree? Shall I just...
I think, Brian, if you ask the question.
Brian, you ask it,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, thanks.
I mean, I suppose it's just really, I suppose my perception, having come into urban design as a mid-career hire, is that I came from a background actually in the city, and the reaction of my ex-colleagues in the city was more or less that, you know, I was doing urban design as a jolly, you know, that it was sort of almost embarrassingly badly paid, you know, and had completely different, more or less that you were sacrificing yourself in quite a significant way, and compared to colleagues of mine who were, where there was a much more of a sense of where I came from, which is you got paid a certain amount, there was a kind of floor to that, and it would only ever go up, you know, and that if you did well, you do very well indeed, and there was nothing wrong with earning 100k, 120k by the time you're 30 years old, and that motivated people. And no one ever in urban design ever talks about money. We're so embarrassed, and we never, you know, and financial success is something that no one ever talks about, partly because hardly anyone ever is achieving it. But there's this sense as if we, and also as a sector, I think we're prone also to endlessly doing work for free. You know, there is so much work being done in our sector by people who are offering their services for free or at extremely low rates, which does not encourage people, I don't think. You know, you look at things like, you know, the work of the Place Alliance, you know, no one's being paid. That's generating no money. There are no paid positions. There's nothing on offer. So how is that attractive to people coming into our sector? That, you know, a lot of the thinking is being done by people who aren't being paid.
Absolutely. I mean, I think those are really valid points. I mean, when one comes from more of a working class background, the desire to sort of educate, to embark on further education is often sort of dovetailed with, you know, improving your life chances, earning a decent salary, and you know, buying a better house than your parents have.
Yes.
And, you know, if you're doing a lot of the work for free, or it's poorly paid and poorly advertised, I mean, it will only, I think if the discipline is very much a sort of a leisurely pastime, you have a tendency to attract people who don't need money to survive, or don't rely upon their full-time job as their means to survive, which is in itself exclusionary.
Yeah, Jack.
Go on, Noah.
There's another one, quite a few actually. But,
yeah, I can see.
There's some good practice here from Birmingham.
Yes, yeah.
Simon, would you like to say something about some of those actions?
Simon, you made a number of good points actually. If you could talk about that, and then also some of the earlier comments you made as well, which I think are really interesting. You may be muted, Simon. You're unmuted now. Okay. While Simon sorts that out, Stephanie Stead has commented as well. Stephanie.
Hello.
Hiya.
I forgot what content now. Was it about the pay?
Yes. Yeah. Just carrying on that.
Yeah. So I'm an architect. I've got my own architect practice, but I also am a tutor at a further education college. And I teach agency and diploma. So most of my students my diploma students are about 18, 19, like 17 to 19-year-olds. My H&C students can be anything up to in their 30s or 40s, but are in general in their 20s. And yeah, pay is a big deal. And so when we're talking about what they want to do after they've done their diploma, for example, do they want to talk about architecture? Is that they all want to be QSs, they all want to be estimators, they all want to be contractors, because that is where the money is. And in that and as soon as they, you know, they unanimously will be really interested in designing, but as soon as they hear about the kind of the salary, then no, they don't want to take it any further, and they make those kind of very clear decision. It's the money in the car, nothing else.
Yeah.
I think it's really sad. It's another way I was brought up, so I'm like, oh really? Oh no. You know, but no, that's the conversation that we have.
And do you see a specific sort of race-based diversity dimension to those decisions?
No, because in the sense of the college I teach at York College, which is, despite the best efforts of the college, who have a really good policy of trying to attract students from BME backgrounds, just by the nature of the York demographic and the York and North Yorkshire demographic, it tends to be white students. They're, in terms of class, for want of a better word, it's not really the word I want to use, but it is a bit more mixed. So our construction department's a big one, and probably our closest rival, for want of a better word, is Leeds.
Right.
The nature of the students between Leeds and York is massive, huge massive difference between the two, both in terms of cultural background and in terms of a kind of a class or a financial background. So I can't speak for Leeds, but I suspect they probably have a slightly different conversation. But even with my lower middle class white students, nope, they want the money. We've done loads of, and in my role as an architect and working for the Construction Industry Council, we've done loads of work in schools in West Yorkshire and Bradford, Huddersfield and that. And it's just not an attractive industry. Even we're not just talking at sites, but like within the professional element of the construction industry, it's just not attractive. And the feedback I'm hearing back, it still seems like a dirty sort of profession. It's not well paid profession, you know. People. And there's a lot of stereotypes going within architecture, surveying, urban designers and stuff. I'm not sure how to overcome that, to be honest. Whether it's about educating parents rather than the kids.
Or getting professionals, improving the standpoint of the work designers do in so that it is appropriately compensated. But that's I guess a bigger question. I'm just mindful of time. I'd like to bring in Ming, who made an interesting point about the practice of urban design. And then I think immediately after Ming's spoken, maybe we'll move back to the final section of our presentation, and then we can open it up to a wider discussion and start making some points. Ming, if you fancy, please do unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I think the problem is that even from right from the beginning, the inception of the urban design group, or as urban design as a profession, we don't want to be a profession. We just say we are kind of a jack of all trade, and you end up, when you try to sell it to the client, even I remember, right at the beginning, nobody even seems to understand. So what do you do? What exactly do you do? Are you an architect? Oh no, I don't do architecture. Are you actually doing planning? No, I'm actually doing not doing planning, or landscape architect, or engineers. So you end up you just not being able to define what we actually do, even though we know as a profession, when you're actually designing a built environment is a really complex thing, and we're trying to be this kind of jack of all trade, pulling everyone together. And until that is actually being understood by the client, and until we really define ourselves of who we are, we will probably just get nowhere in terms of as a job. I mean, that's how I feel anyway.
Yeah, as in, how can you be properly compensated if your role and the value you bring isn't properly understood? So it's a very, very valid point. Noha, do you want to crack on with your slides, and then we can
thanks,
move it on to conclusions at the end? So I will begin sharing my slides.
Great, thank you.
Hopefully everyone can see that.
I am unmuted, aren't I? Yes, I am.
Yep.
Great. Well, I wanted to really bring us back down to human relationships. I've been doing a lot of community engagement with culturally diverse communities, and Aisha, who is also sharing this panel with me, we've both been working at Cardiff University, and Aisha's been also doing a lot of work locally in Cardiff, working in areas of high cultural diversity. So we're bringing a lot of that experience to the table. But it's, I wanted to pay homage to Jane Jacobs, who talks about the importance that cities are places that are created with everybody in mind. So the next slide talks about how we can be a lot more inclusive. Jazz, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sorry, it's just paused.
Okay.
It's one of those technical glitches.
And it happens.
Right, let's see.
Thank you. So how can we create cities for everybody? So I want to cover something called the unconscious bias. Now, the unconscious bias occurs when people favor others who look like them and or share their values. For example, a person may be drawn to someone with a similar educational background from the same area or who is the same ethnicity as them. We all have unconscious biases, and that's the thing. It's the way we're hardwired neurologically. And so the important thing is that we understand that the way our brain works, it's trying to categorize and classify things that we see with our senses and our sight quickly so that we can begin to manage the situation. But of course, laden in all of this are these prejudices. They're learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, and deeply ingrained within our beliefs. And they have the ability to affect our behavior. So these prejudices are essentially either a fear of strangers or feelings of superiority over another. It's formed by an attitude based on incomplete or mistaken information. We make these generalizations, we oversimplify, and we stereotype based on prior assumptions, which lead to faulty beliefs. And of course, faulty beliefs lead to discrimination and inequality. In this survey, the British Integration Survey run by the Challenge in 2019, they found that 44% of all respondents report no ethnic diversity in their social networks. 72% of those whose networks have no socioeconomic diversity also have no ethnic diversity. So this is very much an issue that the UK is facing, that many of us, and of course as practitioners, we have to reflect on this, that who do we know in our network that is different from us? So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. And this is a survey that was done by Comedia, asking local planning authorities what are the barriers to effective consultation of diverse communities. And what they found is that their behavior was influenced. First, they had a perception, but also it might have been a reality, that there's a reluctance of local people from diverse communities participating, that somehow they didn't have the confidence in making their views heard, that it was too much of an effort that they needed to achieve participation. And in some cases, they didn't even think it was relevant at all. So there are other things like difficulty to locate, designing a process which is effective, and then other barriers like language and culture. So there are lots of different reasons people find it difficult from a practitioner's point of view to consult with diverse communities. Could we move on to the next slide? So what can we do about this? As Martin Luther King wisely said, it's no good just being silent. That's not going to change anything. And if we're committed to making a difference, then we need to take a few steps. First, that prejudice is learned. We're not born prejudiced. It's something that we pick up through our culture, through the media, through our traditions, through what we hear from our parents, and so on. It's something that's very much learned. And so we can begin to unlearn it. But the first step is to be self-aware, knowing that you have an unconscious bias, knowing where it shows up. Then setting this intention that you're actually going to do something about it, that you're going to see other people as equals, that you have an element of respect, that you focus on the person, not the stereotype, that each person is an individual in their own right, and they have something to offer and contribute. Then there are different ways of building empathy. One is by learning more about other cultures, other people, other types of diversity, but also exposing yourself to those biases, and doing that by engaging beyond your immediate circle. And then when you do begin to engage with local people, engage at their level, understand what it is that would make sense to them. On many occasions, and I think Aisha is going to cover this, we engage with our visual and drawing skills, our lingo, and of course it's very exclusionary. And make those efforts to reach those who are in the local area from a variety of backgrounds, and take the time to build trust. That can't be done quickly. So we're going to move on to the next slide very quickly. I wanted to bring to your attention this manifesto, which I absolutely love. It's by blackspace.org. And I'm just going to pick up a couple of their points, their principles. I love, for example, this idea of create circles, not lines, which is create less hierarchy and more dialogue, inclusion, and empowerment. I love this one, move at the speed of trust. Grow trust and move together with fluidity at whatever speed is necessary. Quality over quantity, choose critical connections over critical mass. And of course, a very important skill in engagement is deep listening. So be humble learners who practice deep listening. Okay, next please, Jazz. And then just one point I wanted to point out, that this, 2 points really. One is the center on lived experience. I don't think we can really understand places unless we understand it through the eyes of those who live there. And that brings me on to plan with and design with as a principle, which is walk with people as they imagine and realize their own futures. Be connectors, conveners, and collaborators, not representatives. And this kind of speaks to the idea that the practitioner is an expert in place, but in fact, the local people are experts in place, and we're deep listeners able to translate those ideas into something meaningful for them. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over now to Aisha.
Hi, hello. Hi, so here we have some stats that I feel as a practitioner actually reinforce the need and the importance of having diversity and inclusion in the development and design process. So as you can see, that the first stat talks about the deficiency of access to green space. So minorities are less likely to have this basic access if you look at the stats. The second point about overcrowding is most commonly experienced by Black, African and Bangladeshi groups, with just over a third of households living in overcrowded accommodation. Again, you know, the stats are pretty alarming in a way, and to me, it should actually raise a lot of questions as to why this is happening, and how, as urban designers, as us being in the design and development industry, what we can do to change this and overcome these types of alarming stats. Next slide, please. So I can talk about the planning process for the next 2 hours, but I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to try and keep this really simple and straightforward. I've highlighted a few of the significant processes and stages in planning where I feel inclusion is not happening. So there's plenty of opportunity for this to take place. However, ultimately, I think there is a lack of clarity and also importance given to community engagement and consultation in the various processes and stages in planning. One of the main reasons being is still to date, it's not really a statutory requirement. Yes, we have the pre-application consultation, which is statutory. However, in many other aspects and processes of planning, the whole idea of engaging and working with the community are still far from a statutory process, more of a guideline or almost like guidance notes, which cover this area. However, there is a lack of clarity and also a lack of direction within the planning policy frameworks, which actually enable community engagement and consultation to take place. So on the right here, the image of the bucket with holes, this really resonated with myself and Noha when we were discussing this, because we felt like the system is lacking in social justice, really, as being the core principle of the planning system. So therefore, these leaks are what are causing these deficiencies and also these inequalities in society and in development at large. So just to pick up on another point that I'd like to raise, planning committees, for example, currently, if you look at planning committees across the UK, the representation from BAME communities within them, not only are they low, but also the skill set of the members of planning committees don't actually reflect what's needed. And some of the comments I've been reading on the chat is, yes, we are almost playing people's lives when we can't actually relate to a lot of the people that we're designing and developing for. And all this does contribute towards a whole inequality and also the lack of diversity within the process. So just on to the next slide, please, Jazz. Thank you. The last slide, I'd like to talk about responsibility and accountability. And I know in the previous discussions with Jazz and Noha about who's actually responsible for the whole engagement and consultation process. So from my perspective, all the consultants I've listed, such as planners, architects, urban designers, who was responsible for project leading in the engagement process. And again, from my perspective, I think it needs to be somebody who doesn't have an ulterior motive or almost like a conflicting position in the development process. So it needs to be done by an independent engagement consultant. And more increasingly, we're finding this in a lot of the housing schemes that are extremely successful and they have consulted and engaged with communities. It's often done by an independent engagement consultant who then is genuine in working with these communities and feeding back to the planners and architects and urban designers who are part of the design team in genuine responses and genuine feedback, rather than being under pressure by, for example, a planner or an architect who might actually have a bit of a conflict of interest when dealing with the community. And finally, just quickly want to speak about the accountability aspect of engagement and consultation. So often enough, I get approached by members of the community who are very frustrated and very upset that they haven't been engaged with and consulted with about a particular scheme or development. Now, going back to the point, who do they go to when they are so dissatisfied and so left out of the process? Who is accountable for this? And again, from our discussions, we came to the conclusion that ultimately it should be the local planning authority who is the one that's governing the process. Because at the end of the day, they are there for intervention. They are there to keep the planning system in a place where it's not freely run by the market. So when it comes to community engagement and consultation, going back to that, the community should feel comfortable and able enough to go back to the local planning authority and raise their concerns about whether or not they feel they've been part of the process. Not only raise their concerns, but also there should be an outcome of that concern. It shouldn't just be something that's brushed under the carpet. And often enough, there is dissatisfaction expressed by communities with their relationship with their local planning authorities or with their council at large. So I think a lot of work needs to be done in establishing that dialogue and also establishing those relationships between the key players within the development process. So ultimately, the community are able to express their genuine concerns and contribute and collaborate in the design process. So I think that's the last slide. So
yep.
back to you, Jazz.
Sure, thank you very much for that.